Welcome to Storytime. The Red Death by Leigh-An Johnson. At last, Merrick stood in the beast's lair. 50 men strong, veteran soldiers all, had set out on this quest. He alone had made it. Inside the den was unnaturally warm, with the foul smell of sulfur permeating the air. The obsidian walls were shaped in spiked waves where liquid fire had cooled. Where else but a place like this would you find the most unholy of beasts? It had been foretold that a champion of the Lorraine bloodline would conquer the Red Death, and Merrick was his father's last living son. The fever of destiny burned in his heart. It was his fate to destroy these monsters. But the grandeur of his family name that had propelled 50 men on this journey had long since worn thin. The howling winds that lashed the terrain had nearly torn their party from the mountainside a fair few times on this hellish trek. More than half of their number had been lost to creatures of the wild, picking them off a few at a time each night they stopped to rest. After an unexpected fissure had cracked the ground underfoot and melted flesh from bones of 6 men, those few left had deserted. Merrick heard the distant screams of those cowardly traitors carried on the wind that night. Merrick had relentlessly pushed forward. He held no fear. He was the last son of House Lorraine, and destiny walked beside him. Walking deeper into the cavern, torch held aloft, Merrick took long moments to confirm what he was seeing. The rounded white shape stood out sharply against black rocks, clustered in 2s and 3s. Here was the evidence that the red beast seen these last few seasons was in fact a brood mother, and he had found her nest. His heart thrilled as it had when as a child he and his sister Marina had listened to the tales of their ancestors. Their forefathers had sailed from a distant, disease-ridden land to find new, fertile ground. They landed in this rich shore, occupied only by scattered tribes with few arms and no armor. They proved to be no threat. The plague of monsters that haunted the skies were another story. Past kings had raised armies to force the winged fiends back to the mountains from which they spewed forth. The last dragon war had been half a century ago, and now he, Merrick, would end the wars once and for all. He set down the torch and hefted his axe, thinking of how he would be depicted in palace tapestries alongside the greatest heroes of all time. He cleaved his way from one clutch of eggs to another, the great warrior hacking through shell and flesh and bone. Once he'd dispatched these demon spawn, he'd set a trap to lure the mother. He would need a trophy to bring home. Coming on the last egg, a thought occurred. If defeating a dragon would bring him glory, then what of conquering one? Not the adult, of course. That monster would have to be destroyed. But a baby, if he could break the beast and train it? With a dragon brought to heel, he would be invincible, the greatest warrior ever seen. He dropped the axe and drew his short blade to cut the little monster free. As he cut at the egg, contemplating the glory he would bring, he was suddenly able to see the shadow of the baby dragon through the shell. A glaring light behind him outlined the squirming thing. He turned to see the source an instant before flames engulfed him. The old mother moved through the cave, her eyes burning with white-hot rage as she took in the shattered remains of her young. She raised her head and let loose a cry that resonated in the obsidian glass walls. Not the roar of an enraged beast, but a musical cry laced with deepest pain. Her sorrowful wail rose to a crescendo and then cut off abruptly as the smallest of sounds pierced through it. Her eyes snapped to the fractured egg with the human's blade still embedded in it. From within the thin shell, a much smaller voice echoed hers. The chirp of a baby dragon was like no other sound, both melodic and primal. The mother nudged the egg and blew her hot breath over the shell, encouraging the babe to push itself free. The shell split along the crack that the human had already made, and the hatchling tumbled out. Its wings did not unfurl as they should have, and its color was far too dull, the skin soft with scales that had not yet hardened. The youngling had not been long enough in the shell. The old mother's heart ached for her murdered brood, and this little one who may be crippled and could still yet die. But it needed her care, and that was all she knew. She nudged the hatchling towards the charred remains of its sibling's murderer, purring to the babe, letting it know that it was safe and encouraging it to eat. They could not stay here now, and he would need all the strength that his premature body could muster. This too young chick was her kind's last hope for the future. The Red Death can be found alongside other short stories that are intended to be expanded into longer novels in my collection, The Other Side of the Sky, available on Amazon. Check our show notes for the link to purchase this book, and stay tuned for more short stories here on our podcast.